Hi, I'm Sharon Renfro. Our Hearts and Minds at SharonRenfro.com believes that we must open our minds before we can open our hearts to one another, a fundamental idea to an alternative way to understand the psychology of relationships. Now, this means that thinking is the key to successful, meaningfully connected, long-term, sustainable relationships. Today's video applies the 3 steps of thinking to the relationship issue of emotions in relationships. Now, I'm going to briefly define each step of thinking, and then I'm going to give some examples of how to use that step of thinking, looking at the issue of emotions in relationships. This is an example so that you can begin to apply the 3 steps of thinking to your relationship issues. Now, the first step of thinking is research, and that means that we gather pertinent and objective information. Number 1, emotions and feelings are very different. I'm going to repeat that because it's incredibly important. Emotions and feelings are very different. Number 2, only 2 emotions can be experienced. So our emotional system does a very quick assessment of everything that happens to us, and it determines whether we are safe or threatened based on very little information. It was designed to be used in a very dangerous, physically dangerous environment. So quick responses are critical. It means we use very little information, so we can do a very quick assessment. Now, there are 2 emotions that can be experienced. 1, when safety is perceived, the sense of calm, or when threat is perceived, the sense of anxiety. Number 3, calm is an individual experience based on the individual sensing being safe as an individual in a relationship situation, based on the need to have a balance in the need to be an individual self and the need to be in a relationship. Both of those are operating constantly all the time. So those needs have to somehow be in balance. Number 4, anxiety is an individual experience based on the individual sensing being threatened as an individual in a relationship situation based on an imbalance between the need to be an individual and the need to be in a relationship. Number 5, at birth, this emotional assessment is the only assessment available to the infant. It's real basic. When calm, the infant senses safety and life energy can be expended toward all of the processes that ensure survival and thrival of the individual. When anxious, the individual senses a threat due to not having its needs met in the relationship for protection and care. When threatened, all life energy is directed toward the relationship to have the relationship meet the unmet needs. This early interaction determines whether or not the individual learns that relationships are generally safe or threatening. This learned perception and interpretation of threat or safety of relationships continues to influence the individual throughout his or her life. That means that we take early learning into adult relationships. Number 6, when threatened, the individual can select from only 4 behaviors to interact in the parent-child relationship: conflict, fight, distance, flight, pretend, camouflage, and cutoff, play dead. Number 7, excuse me. Number 7, those behaviors are found throughout nature, and they represent an instinctual reaction to life events. Number 8, the emotional brain, the lizard brain, assesses everything we experience, everything, and it makes some sort of an interpretation and assessment of whether we're safe or whether we're threatened. Depending on the lizard brain, to have a relationship doesn't seem like such a smart idea. Number 9, to ensure the most instantaneous response possible to a threat, which is incredibly important in a dangerous environment, very limited information through the perceptual organs is recognized. All kinds of complex information is simply filtered from awareness, leading us to make life decisions on emotional and simple cues learned early in life. Now, the second step of thinking is reason, and that means that we're going to apply logic to the pertinent and objective information that we gathered, and that allows us the possibility of forming a very deep understanding of ourselves as an individual and also relationship process. Number 1, because information picked up by perceptions is so limited in the emotional assessment, our view of relationships is very simple, and it does not automatically include any consideration of another person other than ourselves. So you can't consider the other person. Number 2, the understanding of the world is I'm calm or I'm anxious. Whatever reason for this calm or anxiety is actually a learned interpretation of relationship interaction during those early years of life. This interpretation predates the ability to use logic. The long term is not considered. The short-term reduction of anxiety right now is all that really is of concern. Number 3, we don't extend our learning about individuals or relationships when our brain begins to function with more complexity. As a result, we remain emotionally immature as individuals and essentially disconnected from meaningful and sustainable long-term relationships. Number 4, emotional reactions prevent more complex relationship interactions and limit greatly self-awareness. Without self-awareness, the awareness of others, which is essential to consider another person, it's impossible. We don't even recognize that we need to consider another person. Number 5, because we are using very limited information to interpret what happens, we are very, very often in error, and emotions can't help us to self-correct. The third step of thinking is reflection. Now, this means that we apply the understanding that we've gathered to increase our self-awareness and to recognize how we are related to others. Number 1, at planned intervals, set aside time to intentionally expand your perceptions. How do these new perceptions alter your interpretations of events? How does your objective and pertinent information help you to determine which interpretation offers the most logical explanation of a situation? Number 2, ask yourself the question, how does your relationship partner view this situation differently from you? And what information might he or she be using to draw conclusions? Use empathy. How can you be more sensitive to your relationship partner without losing sight of yourself, your own point of view? What does self-respect mean? What behaviors demonstrate respect for yourself? What behaviors demonstrate respect for your relationship partner? Both are critical to have a long-term, sustainable, meaningful relationship that's really meaningfully connected. Number 3, take your time to respond to situations in your relationship. There are very, very few emergencies in relationships. Ask yourself, what other options are there to the experience of safety or threat? Number 4, ask yourself if your relationship could benefit from behaving like a lizard or from using more complex brain functions, the more adaptive strategies that evolution gifted us. We must open our minds in order to be able to open our hearts to one another. Now, if these ideas have been beneficial to you, please like us so that others may find us. And you may also find more information and in-depth discussions in our free podcast series, Our Hearts and Minds, The Psychology of Relationships, located at either SharonRenfro.com or at Castbox. I hope that these ideas have been really helpful to you, and thank you so much for listening.